What I want to do in this time is to celebrate the life of my best friend, Arthur Hastings, an outstanding transpersonal psychologist, one of the people who started that whole field of transpersonal psychology, an incredible teacher. So I welcome anyone who is viewing this celebration, especially former students of Arthur's, who will remember the many, many kindnesses and useful directions and hints and positive criticisms he gave them in developing their dissertations. He was very loved at the Institute of Transpersonal Psychology. Technically, I suppose this is a eulogy, but in point of fact, it's really more of a celebration. Arthur led a very wonderful life. I'm also, even though it seems sort of odd, going to welcome Arthur. Arthur, I hope you're here, in some sense. Now, that seems sort of funny since he died, but I'm going to treat Arthur as if there may be some real sense in which he's here. And I'll tell you why that's not just my feelings toward him, but there's scientific evidence that people survive death. I originally gave a shortened form of this eulogy for Arthur Hastings a couple of years ago. He passed away on the 13th of April 2014, as you can see in the slide, and we had a community celebration at the Institute of Transpersonal Psychology for them. It's now called Sophia University, incidentally. Arthur was 79, he died of acute leukemia, and it was a good death in a variety of ways, no pain to speak of. The original recording of what I said was lost, unfortunately, so this is the new one. And this is a good time for me to record this expanded version. Actually, I just found out a week ago that I have a cousin who is in the death process. Might not last more than another week or so, if that much. So it's all very relevant to me personally and relevant to many of the people who will be viewing this who have people dying. The slide that I have up there now shows Arthur and his wife Sandy Hastings, who were a very good couple, very close to one another. And it's taken at the Esalen Institute, a place where humanistic psychology and transpersonal psychology were developed in so many important ways. And the sun is shining through the mist. And I've added in a classic statue, the Bodhisattva Manjushri, as if he's blessing Arthur and Sandy. I can't really tell you exactly what a bodhisattva is. They're very important in Buddhism. They're pretty enlightened. They're not fully enlightened, but they're people who were originally so wonderfully intentioned that they vowed to never trip out to some kind of full enlightenment until every sentient being was enlightened. And they expect that's going to take a long time. So this is really an incredible commitment to being wonderfully helpful to the rest of us. So here we have Manjushri blessing Arthur and Sandy. Manjushri represents transcendent wisdom also. The sword represents cutting through confusion. He has scriptures in his left hand. I don't think you can see that very clearly, but it's passing on that wisdom so that it can be helpful to us. So I'm using this collage as kind of a focus symbol to celebrate Arthur's life. Now there's so many things I could say about Arthur. Lots of others talked about the wonderful things he did at the memorial ceremony that we had, because he helped so many people. He must have served on the dissertation committees and advised hundreds of students at the Institute of Transpersonal Psychology over the years. I also, coming back to this focus slide with Manjushri, I personally suspect Arthur's a bodhisattva. You know, I don't know what that means in terms of classical religious ideas or anything like that, but he went out of his way, way beyond the call of duty, to be helpful people. And Arthur, I'm sure you're embarrassed by my calling you a bodhisattva, but hey, you're that kind of guy. I'm going to focus more on his more scholarly accomplishments because that's my particular bias. I'm a scholarly type. And there are more of them than I can talk about, but I'm going to talk about a few of Arthur's contributions to understanding our knowledge of mind and spirit. Particularly, I'm going to talk about the psychology of channeling, on which Arthur was probably the leading authority on the planet. I'm going to talk about his psychomantium research. I'll explain that later. Uh, he was trained in oratory and persuasion and so forth, so he did pioneering work on the psychology of resistance to belief. Why don't we change our mind about what we think is real when in the face of excellent evidence that way? He also understood that transpersonal psychology is not an abstract philosophy or a laboratory study of strange little phenomena. It's about vital experiences and altered states of consciousness, such as might happen in visions and drugs and dreams and so forth, are an important part of doing that. So he did very interesting work on inducing altered states of consciousness like drug-induced, but using it with hypnosis. And he was also very concerned with how people made good use of the experiences that gave them insight into our transpersonal spiritual nature. So he wrote about the counseling aspects of this. It's not just more knowledge, it's applying the knowledge in your life. Arthur was very concerned about his work going on, too, especially his psychomantium research. He was, I think, perhaps the only one doing really systematic research rather than just a little shot at it here and there. And he was given some money to do that research. I don't know whether that money still exists for research, whether it will happen, but I hope when I talk about it that it will inspire other people to research this interesting psychomantium stuff. Okay, a little bit of background. Arthur and I were connected by parapsychology, by the paranormal. This is a slide of Arthur about the time my wife Judy and I met in 1963 when we came out here because I was doing a postdoctoral fellowship at Stanford. Arthur and another graduate student had, if you look at the next slide, investigated a poltergeist case, one of these things where things seem to fly around the house with nobody near them and it's all very mysterious. So poltergeist is a German word meaning noisy ghosts. Ghosts aren't popular nowadays, and actually Arthur and his colleague Stanley Krippner decided that in this particular case it was probably a bored grandson having to stay with his grandparents for a while who was tossing stuff around to get attention while people's backs were turned. But he was distinguishing the possibility of real psychic phenomena like might happen with a poltergeist from the stuff that fools us, and there's certainly lots of that. He was trained in reasoning and logic. He was an excellent amateur magician, so he was very good at catching tricks. He was also very good at being a magician. I've watched him do some of his magic tricks many times over the years, and so I was on the lookout for how is that done. I never could figure out how he did most of them, and he enjoyed seeing me just be totally bamboozled. Because Arthur had done this work distinguishing fake poltergeist sort of stuff from the real stuff and knew about parapsychology, I was instructed to get in contact with him by the person who was the leading parapsychologist at that time, Joseph Banks Rhine at Duke University. I think Rhine thought of me back then as someone who was a little too wild in what I thought might happen, but Arthur was solid and discriminating of stuff, and maybe he would calm me down. Well, Arthur became my best friend, and he certainly calmed me down on many occasions, but he also really stimulated me to think about this stuff. It's interesting, Arthur was a quiet, introverted sort of person, and yet he was very sensitive. And it made him a good administrator. You know, you don't think of shy, quiet people as administrators, but during his time, he was not only a founding faculty member of the Institute for Transpersonal Psychology, but he served as dean, he served as acting president at times, he was a co-director of the William James Research Center there. All this was helping so many students work out a research program to qualify for their doctorate degrees. And as I hinted earlier, he had a sensitivity to students that he could help them get through the stress of graduate school. I just read something recently that graduate school is really stressful for most people. I didn't know that because I thought I was so lucky to be able to go to graduate school when I went through it that I didn't notice the stress that much, but it's really there, and he helps so many people that way. One of the things I'm going to do is, as much as I can, contact former students about this celebration so they could look at it. So Arthur was my oldest friend and a colleague for 50 years, and I really miss him. So I said at the beginning, I'm going to talk in some ways as if Arthur were really here. And I do suspect there's a way in which he's really here. Not quite the obvious way we think about it, because whatever death does, it certainly would change the way our mind functions, but there's some kind of survival. And I'm making that statement not out of a desire to be in contact with a friend like Arthur someday or a fear of my own death, but because there's excellent scientific evidence to suggest that we do survive death in some form. And I want to talk a little bit about why that's a scientific statement, because this is one of Arthur's field of expertise. A lot of parapsychological research nowadays is laboratory experiments, guessing at cards or hidden pictures and things like that. But one of the things that triggered it off was the rise of modern spiritualism in the late 1800s and mediums who claimed that they could channel dead people to bring us messages from them to reassure us that they were there. And it's death that brings us here for this particular celebration, of course. Well, Arthur was one of the world's, and I probably could say the world's leading expert on the psychology of mediumship, except he preferred to call it channeling, because that was a hot topic back in the 80s and so forth. Channeling usually means somebody says they're getting in touch with some wise spirit who gives philosophical advice, and if you look at the kind of stuff that comes through that way, some of it is basically a lot of platitudes and some of it is pretty wise stuff, but you really have no idea whether there are actual spirits of any sort, wise or not, or whether it's the unconscious minds of the people doing the channeling. But some channelers are also known as mediums, and they claim to put you in contact with the spirits of those who've died, and often try to provide proof of survival by having those spirits, for instance, tell you things that would have been known to the dead person but not known to anything else. This is tricky research, and there's lots of ways people can be fooled. It's tricky research also because people usually are kind of violent in either believing it or not believing it, and very few people actually bother to look at what the evidence actually is. Arthur not only looked at the evidence, but in his sensitivity to avoiding useless conflict, decided to focus on the psychology of channeling. Not whether they're really channeling spirits or not, but what does it mean to channel? How does the mind of a person doing the channeling work? So this next slide shows you the book he wrote as a result of that, With the Tongues of Men and Angels. And it's the most sophisticated book on the psychology of channeling that's ever been done. He spent a couple of years really reading accounts of people who did channeling and so forth, and gave us the best look we had of what does it take to be a channeler and so forth. Now, as I say, people usually have violent emotions with regard to death and whether we survive it or not. And we're also afraid of death by and large. So most people deal with death by simply not thinking about it if they can at all possibly avoid it. Some people espouse a philosophy of materialism, and from that perspective, of course, the idea of survival is nonsense. You are your brain dies, end of story. Other people pick some particular religion's teachings about survival, and that's the truth. Just stay with that. And again, don't mention evidence. Arthur spent a number of years doing research with a procedure called the psychomantium. If you look historically, all cultures have had methods to get in touch with the spirits of the deceased. We have a stereotype maybe of a gypsy gazing into a crystal ball to get in touch with the dead, mediums going into trances, priests maybe channeling a god who does the communication or something like that. But it's, except for modern times, it's always been a major part of the culture. Now, we often think of our Western civilization as having been started by the Greeks with their emphasis on rationality, but the Greeks also were big into contacting the dead. I have a slide here that shows the ruins of a special temple in Greece devoted to contacting the spirits of the dead. These were largely underground. People wanting to contact the spirit of a dead person would go through religious rites to be blessed, and then they would spend several days in this underground temple being prepared for it. And finally, they would come into a large underground room in which there was a gigantic vat of oil down below them. They were on a balcony. Just one torch in the room somewhere, so there was some flickering light coming off the surface of the oil. And many times people reported visions of the dead person they wanted to contact emerging from that flickering surface of the oil, and often giving them information that they wanted. Now, Raymond Moody was the person who unearthed a lot of this information about the Greeks and other people's use of things like the psychomantium. Raymond Moody's the person who also brought near-death experiences into prominence in our culture. Now, the psychomantium is not just being in a dark room, though. It's the psychological preparation that goes into this. It's the beliefs you take in. And of course, having it in an underground temple really helps. That reinforces your beliefs. So the next slide shows you what I'd like to be true, that the Institute of Transpersonal Psychology built their own Egyptian-like temple with the special underground laboratories and whatnot. But of course, that's a dream. That costs a lot of money. What Arthur and his students did build, as shown in this next diagram, was a portable psychomantium, although it was used mainly at the Institute of Transpersonal Psychology. They basically had a framework that could turn into a room that was completely covered floor, ceiling, and walls by dense black curtains. And inside the room was a very comfortable chair, a very dim light bulb on the floor under the chair, so the room was not completely dark. And as you sat there all relaxed, you could look into a tilted mirror that was tilted so it just looked toward the black ceiling. Except remember, everything is not absolutely dark, but it's pretty darn dark. So you're looking at what seems like into indefinite space of some sort. But again, I stress, it's the psychology of this that really matters, that makes the psychomantium effective. So I've added here that the psychological set, what do you expect to get out of this? What have the people doing the psychomantium work told you is likely to happen and so forth? That's really important. What is your intention? Okay, this research was done with people who felt that they had unfinished business with some friend or relative who had died. So I can't stress enough, because Arthur really understood this, that a psychomantium is not just a dimly lit room with a mirror in it. The psychological set you create, starting with working with the need people have, okay? I mean, subjects were interviewed at length about why they wanted to contact someone who had died and so forth. And then creating and reinforcing the psychological set that nothing in particular might happen, but all sorts of things, on the other hand, might happen that were relevant to this need, and then things would happen. Here's an actual picture of the psychomantium setup showing the tilted mirror. Yes, there it is. That's Arthur demonstrating it. He was, this wasn't too long before he eventually died, so Arthur wasn't looking too terribly healthy in these pictures, but he kept working as long as possible to try to share the notes and results from his students. So, okay. People went into this, were interviewed for why they needed to contact it. Over 100 people went through in the initial studies of this and were interviewed afterwards about what happened. A lot of them experienced a feeling of deep contact, obviously with the people, or person rather, that they were trying to. Others had a more general feeling that even though they didn't see the spirit of the person, they intuitively now understood what the cause of the conflict was and how to go about resolving it, and they felt good at having helped resolve it, and they felt like the spirit of the person felt good at having had it resolved. So it was quite amazing. Now again, Arthur didn't push the controversial part of this provides evidence for survival after death, but focused on this as a practical technique for helping to resolve grief, which is a big problem for a lot of people. And Arthur and his students ended up getting an article published in Omega, the Journal of Mental Health and Dying, which is the leading research journal for dealing with questions about grief resolution. Arthur has all the students who worked with him on it listed in there as co-authors. He was not like some academics or scientists who try to hog the credit. He just helped his students in so many different ways. Okay, so why am I emphasizing Arthur's psychomantium research? It's partly because it was just so important and I want to honor Arthur. And it's partly because it helps to create experiences dealing with the transpersonal, with the spiritual. It helps to reinforce the feeling I had, a game I want to play right from the very beginning, that Arthur, maybe in some sense you're listening to this. Notice I'm looking up, that's my cultural conditioning. Arthur Hastings was a good guy, so he must be in heaven rather than looking down below. But anyway, this was very important kind of research. Arthur and I both were very familiar with the last century's evidence dealing with the question of survival. And it's very complicated, but we both ended up feeling that there's enough evidence that somebody who says there's no evidence for survival of death is just ignorant, and or prejudice, usually a combination of them. Some people are convinced it's enough to prove the case. Both of us felt it's pretty likely, and we're going to find out personally one of these days. I often express it as, I don't know if I'm going to survive death, but I won't be too surprised if I regain consciousness after I die. Probably a little period of confusion first. But on the other hand, I'll be kind of surprised if I regain consciousness, because a lot of our ordinary identity is based on the way the body, brain, and nervous system work. Arthur and I both felt this was our best understanding of the evidence so far. Okay, now of course, from a materialistic perspective, this is all nonsense. Here's a slide showing how diehard materialists would say this. They'd cross out Manjushri. That's just an artistic fantasy. There never was a Manjushri, or certainly not some unusual psychic being who can bless people. But they cross out Arthur because he died. Arthur's wife Sandy is still left there. Ardent materialists essentially don't look at the evidence and throw all this away, but from a transpersonal perspective, there's more to it than that. And yet, I've mentioned several times that people don't look at the evidence. So one of the contributions Arthur made was investigating the question of resistance to belief. His own training was in how do you persuade people of various points of view. And this is a particular example of so much resistance to seeing a genuinely spiritual, transpersonal part of people. So he ended up writing a landmark article called The Resistance to Belief, to begin to explore the ways we can reject evidence that doesn't fit with the worldview we've already been conditioned to believe in or have an emotional attachment to. It's not the answers to everything, but it certainly opens up a major area of understanding how we grow. I've also mentioned that transpersonal psychology is not just some kind of philosophy or abstract set of intellectual ideas. It's about powerful experiences that happen to people that drastically change the way they see themselves and the world and how they should go about living. Well, okay, how do you get experiences? It's not just enough to have intellectual ideas about them. If people almost die, they usually have incredible transpersonal experiences, but that's not a terribly practical technique because most people who come close to death don't have a near-death experience, they die, and we don't hear anything about it. Psychedelic drugs are another major source of powerful transpersonal experiences, but in our current hysterical state, they're genuinely illegal, almost no place to do anything with them legally. But Arthur wondered about, could you induce the kind of experiences psychedelics do without actually using the drugs? Now, one of the ways Arthur helped people was he worked part-time as a hypnotherapist. Academic salaries just aren't that good nowadays. He helped a lot of people that way, so he began to wonder, could you use hypnotic suggestion to create aspects of psychedelic experiences that would get powerful enough to be of some difference? So he found people who'd all had experiences with the drug MDMA. I'm trying to think of the actual chemical name for it and I can't. MDMA. He did some hypnosis training sessions with these and then went through a session where he suggested various aspects of the MDMA experience would start occurring in hypnosis, and then found from people's reports that, yeah, they started building on each other and they had experiences as if they'd actually taken the drug. These were people who'd had MDMA before, so they could make this a comparison. This came out in an article of his, an extended non-drug MDMA-like experience evoked through post-hypnotic suggestion. What a wonderful academic title, but that's the way you need to play the game to get these things published. A very powerful contribution. Not that we think, people should dump LSD in the water supply or something like that, but Arthur and I were both of the opinion that used properly, by the right people in the right situations, psychedelics can really help people expand. Oh, almost finally, exceptional human experiences, psychedelics, near-death experiences, and the like. What do you do if you have one? It's not a matter that people suddenly have a mystical transpersonal experience and everything in their life is perfect from that point on. There's often a lot of trouble trying to integrate that experience into people's life. So the last contribution of Arthur's I'll talk about there was his article on creating a counseling approach to parapsychological experience. He and I both talked to people who had had something like a spontaneous telepathic experience or a near-death experience and were frightened by it or worried that they were crazy or something like that. And some of these people had the unfortunate experience of going to conventional therapists, psychiatrists and the like, who treated it as if it was an inherently crazy experience, but it's not. So how do you help people integrate these experiences into life? Again, Arthur Hastings was opening up a whole new area of making sense of transpersonal experiences. Okay, I've been kind of intellectual. I'm an intellectual. Arthur was an intellectual. But he was also a very sensitive person and a pioneer of transpersonal psychology. And my intuition is that there's a poem I just feel like reading for a gift to Arthur and a gift to other people who are facing death or who have lost relatives. It's a nursery rhyme, actually. Calling it a poem maybe make it too high class. And if you think of it just at an ordinary level, it's something that was told to tiny little Dutch kids to help them get ready for life. And yet the symbolism in it just feels intuitively very nice for people who are transiting from this life into something new and traveling a crystal sea. So I'm going to read you the old nursery rhyme, Winkin', Blinkin', and Nod. Winkin', Blinkin', and Nod one night sailed off in a wooden shoe, sailed on a river of crystal light into a sea of dew. "Where are you going and what do you wish?" the old moon asked the three. "We've come to fish for the herring fish that live in this beautiful sea. Nets of silver and gold have we," said Winkin', Blinkin', and Nod. The old moon laughed and sang a song as they rocked in the wooden shoe, and the wind that sped them all night long ruffled the waves of dew. The little stars were the herring fish that lived in that beautiful sea. "Now cast your nets wherever you wish, never afeard are we," so cried the stars to the fishermen three. All night long their nets they threw to the stars in the twinkling foam. Then down from the skies came the wooden shoe, bringing the fishermen home. 'Twas all so pretty a sail it seemed, as if it could not be, and some folks thought 'twas a dream they dreamed, of sailing that beautiful sea. But I shall name you fishermen three, Winkin', Blinkin', and Nod. Winkin' and Blinkin' are two little eyes, and Nod is a little head, and the wooden shoe that sailed the skies is a wee one's trundle bed. So shut your eyes while Mother sings of wonderful sights that be, and you shall see the beautiful things as you rock in the misty sea, where the old shoe rocked the fishermen three, Winkin', Blinkin', and Nod. Thank you for this opportunity to celebrate my friend Arthur Hastings' life. I hope it may be of inspiration and help to all of you, because we'll all be sailing that sea someday, I think. Thank you.